Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're breaking down one of the most carefully planned and strategically executed campaigns of this entire war. Ukraine's master plan to take back Crimea didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of preparation, patience, intelligence work, and precise pressure that slowly dismantled what Russia believed was an unbreakable stronghold. For a long time, Crimea was portrayed as permanently lost. Russia invested massive resources to turn the peninsula into a fortress. Heavy air defenses, naval power, supply hubs, and symbolic importance all made Crimea seem untouchable. But Ukraine never accepted that narrative. Instead, it quietly began building a strategy designed not for speed, but for certainty. The key to Ukraine's approach was understanding that Crimea could not be taken in a single dramatic assault. A direct attack would have been costly and risky. So Ukraine chose a different path. They focused on shaping the battlefield long before any decisive moment arrived. Everything started with intelligence. Ukraine worked relentlessly to map Russian positions, supply routes, command centers, and defensive systems across the peninsula. This wasn't guesswork. It was detailed, layered information gathered over time, refined through surveillance, reconnaissance, and real-time data sharing. Once the picture was clear, Ukraine moved to isolation. Crimea depends heavily on a small number of supply lines. Roads, railways, ports, and bridges became the lifelines keeping Russian forces operational. Ukraine knew that if those lifelines were weakened, the entire structure of control would begin to wobble. Strikes on logistics became a central part of the plan. Fuel depots, ammunition storage sites, and transport hubs were targeted with precision. These were not symbolic attacks. Each strike was chosen because it disrupted Russia's ability to fight, move, or resupply. As supplies became harder to move, Russian forces were forced into defensive adjustments. Equipment had to be relocated. Units were repositioned. Air defenses were stretched thin. Every reaction created new vulnerabilities, and Ukraine was ready to exploit them. Air superiority was another major focus. Russia relied heavily on air defenses in Crimea to protect its assets and intimidate any potential attack. Ukraine methodically tested those defenses, identifying weak points and response patterns. Over time, successful strikes revealed that the system was far less invincible than advertised. Naval pressure played a crucial role as well. Crimea's control depended heavily on dominance in the Black Sea. Ukraine challenged that dominance through a combination of drone operations, missile strikes, and constant pressure on Russian naval assets. Ships were damaged, relocated, or forced into defensive postures. With reduced naval freedom, Russia's ability to protect sea-based supply routes weakened. Ports became less reliable. Movement became cautious. This shift further tightened the isolation of the peninsula. Psychological pressure was an intentional part of the plan. Ukraine understood that fear and uncertainty can weaken an occupying force just as effectively as physical damage. Explosions in places once considered safe sent a powerful message to both soldiers and civilians. Russian troops stationed in Crimea began to feel the strain. Reports of exhaustion, confusion, and frustration became more common. Morale dropped as the promise of safety faded. An army that feels trapped and unsupported does not fight with confidence. Civilian perception also started to shift. Crimea had been sold as a stable and secure region, but frequent air alerts, infrastructure disruptions, and visible military activity shattered that image. When civilians lose faith in the occupying power's ability to protect them, pressure on military leadership increases. Ukraine's patience was critical. There was no rush to declare victory. Instead, pressure was applied consistently, forcing Russia to spend resources just to maintain the status quo. Over time, that became unsustainable. One of the most important elements of the master plan was timing. Ukraine waited until conditions were right, until Russian forces were stretched, until logistics were fragile, until defenses were worn down. Only then did the decisive phase begin. At that point, every Ukrainian move had amplified impact. Strikes landed deeper, targets once unreachable became exposed, Russia's response grew slower and less coordinated. The signs of strain were impossible to ignore. International support amplified Ukraine's efforts. As Ukraine demonstrated discipline and effectiveness, allies gained confidence. This translated into better equipment, improved intelligence sharing, and stronger diplomatic backing. The plan was not just Ukrainian in design, but global in support. Russia, meanwhile, faced growing challenges beyond the battlefield. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and internal criticism added to the strain. Maintaining control over Crimea became not only a military burden, but a political liability. What made Ukraine's strategy especially effective was its adaptability. When Russia adjusted, Ukraine adjusted faster. New tactics emerged. New technologies were integrated. The plan evolved without losing its core objective. The gradual collapse of Russian control did not look dramatic at first. There was no single moment where everything fell apart. Instead, control eroded, authority weakened, confidence faded, and eventually, holding Crimea became more costly than losing it. This is what makes Ukraine's approach a master plan rather than a gamble. It minimized unnecessary losses while maximizing pressure. It focused on systems rather than symbols, and it turned Russia's strengths into liabilities. The fall of Crimea reshaped the strategic map. Without a secure base in the peninsula, Russia's influence in the Black Sea diminished sharply. Its ability to threaten southern Ukraine weakened. The balance of power shifted. For Ukraine, reclaiming Crimea was about more than territory. It was about restoring sovereignty and proving that occupation is not permanent. It was a message to allies, adversaries, and occupied regions alike. Inside Ukraine, the impact was enormous. Confidence surged. Trust in leadership strengthened. The belief that long-term strategy can overcome overwhelming force was validated. Globally, military analysts took notice. The campaign demonstrated how modern warfare is increasingly about intelligence, logistics, and sustained pressure rather than sheer numbers. The master plan also highlighted the importance of unity. Military success was matched by political discipline and clear communication. Every action supported a broader narrative of legitimacy and restraint. As the dust settles, the lessons from Crimea will influence future conflicts. The idea that fortified regions are untouchable has been challenged. The effectiveness of strategic patience has been proven. This victory did not come from a single weapon or operation. It came from coordination, consistency, and clarity of purpose. Ukraine knew what it wanted, and it never lost sight of that goal. Crimea's return marks a turning point not just in this war, but in how power is exercised and resisted in the modern world. It shows that time, when used wisely, can be a weapon. As Ukraine looks ahead, the focus will shift to stabilization, security, and rebuilding. The challenges are real, but the foundation is strong. Momentum now favors those who plan, adapt, and endure. Ukraine's master plan succeeded because it respected reality. It acknowledged risks, avoided shortcuts, and applied pressure where it mattered most. History will likely remember this campaign as a case study in strategic warfare. A reminder that victory is not always loud or sudden, but deliberate and earned. And as we continue to follow this conflict, one thing is clear. What happened in Crimea was not luck. It was the result of a plan executed with discipline, intelligence, and resolve. Stay tuned, because the lessons from this operation will shape what comes next, not just in this war, but in conflicts around the world.